Hello. Okay, I am not a content creator. I already tried to create this video and it was like 25 minutes long and I was like, ain't nobody gonna watch that. So I'm gonna try and condense it a lot. But essentially I wanna answer the question of how did we get here? Because everybody has been asking this and I just came out of 2 years of graduate school. It was spiritually completely exhausting. But I think because Charlie started TPUSA because he realized that in university he wasn't receiving an education but an indoctrination, and his assassination happened on a university campus. It's really important to look at what beliefs are taken as fact and how this actually informs what we think as society. Like, how do we get to the point where Charlie Kirk was literally killed for the words he spoke? A lot of people say like, oh, it's good versus evil and sin. And that is true. Yes, but we have an enemy who works in very manipulative and strategic ways over time. And so we're going to unpack that and I'm going to try and do it very succinctly. Basically, through a lot of years of Western philosophy, ideas that used to be like conversations that happen in universities and people would dialogue have become teaching students what to think instead of how to think. And this happens all across the board, but there's some really like specific assumptions that we now have that weren't always the case. So basically, like, philosophy started as a way of supporting and clarifying Christian theology, but it's become a way of self-actualizing. So we've come to believe that we can basically create our own identity apart from God. This comes from humanism. Then what happened from there is that knowledge became culturally understood as the way to empower your journey to self-fulfillment. Okay, this is from the Enlightenment. Then the definition of knowledge actually shifted away from objective reality, where instead knowledge became understood as a construct of, and like a fabrication of what happens in our conscious experience. Okay, this is phenomenology. So we're kind of going like a quick history lesson here. Then we're in the period called critical theory. And it's really interesting because we just accept critical theory. A lot of people accept critical theory without realizing that it is actually a trajectory of Western philosophy that comes out of Marx's idealism. And the belief here is that capitalism eventually is going to resort to fascism. And so we need to be critical of these power systems and give people the ability to have the knowledge to break free from their oppressor as a victim. But remembering here that knowledge is personal experience. So we have taken personal experience and woven it with the fabric of truth and then called our personal experience truth, and then said, we need to be free from the oppressor because our experience shows that we're a victim. Or it shows that you're an oppressor, or that I'm an oppressor if you're buying into the guilt of being a white person or whatever it might be. So we have to label ourselves into categories of privilege. This is like literally just from the education I just went through. We're taught how to label ourselves. If you read the research articles, there's going to be one that pops up on the screen here. I'm not going to read it out, but essentially the person is like, okay, these are my biases, my prejudices. This is why I'm advantaged. This is why I'm disadvantaged. And then says, out of this framework, I critically interrogate my experience of people who are outside my frame of reference. This is important. So it's literally saying, based on my experience, I get to evaluate my experience of you as a human being. This was also applied in our coursework. Again, I'm going to flip through it. If you want to pause and look at them, you can. But we were taught how to essentially label and put our clients into preconceived categories based on race, religion, sex, gender, blah, 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 blah. Then there was like all these intentionally leading statements. We have to talk about how we feel, and then go through our religious privilege, our size privilege, our abilities, our white, cisgender, straight, And top it off by making sure that we check in on our emotional well-being by selecting pretty little pictures of choppy waves or a calm sea, just to make sure that the adult education system is aware of my emotional capacity to complete the coursework based on how difficult this topic was for me. That's not even to mention like all of the classwork about learning like about all of the amories and the sexualities and things I just didn't want to really know. Also that I have to literally sign on the dotted line that I believe in the core tenets of critical theory in order to join my professional association, which I haven't done yet, and that's a whole other thing. So let's just look for a minute at the two core major research philosophies. There's quantitative research and there's qualitative. Quantitative research believes that an ultimate truth exists independent of experience and that it's possible to discover this reality. So there is truth. We can figure it out. Qualitative research believes that reality and truth are human creations and constructed by human interpretation. So essentially, there is no truth. We cannot figure it out. We just keep learning and creating our own knowledge. And I was reminded repeatedly over these 2 years, you need to critically examine the perception of what you consider to be research, as if like wanting to search at quantitative data was some kind of offense to moral empathy. Like, okay. So anyway, we studied things like qualitative heuristic self-inquiry. And in literal terms, what this is, the constructed reality, that's qualitative, of human experience, heuristic, based on my own story. This is what self-inquiry is. So I'm going to take a minute to do what I was asked to do and critically examine the research, aside from all this academic jargon and blabbery, and reword this. Qualitative heuristic self-inquiry is the rigorous exploration of me. Let's try just for a second taking out the word rigorous and maybe replace it with obsessive. Just a thought. I wanted to stick in an article, honestly, by someone who works in critical disability studies, but the difficulty now is that academia is so intertwined with self, you really can't critique someone's ideas without actually just defaming their character or whatever you want to call that. And I don't want to do that because I do value, again, the humanity of my professors, even though the ideas are like, whoop, bye. So whatever. You can go through all kinds of terminological loopholes to say that your personal reflections are unbiased if you're studying yourself, but we actually know that based on human experience, our retrospective perception of events is often inaccurate, and we misremember things and will highlight specific aspects based on our current circumstance. This is one of the reasons things like court systems have statutes of limitations in place, is because our perception of past experiences is not always reality, and we can't necessarily know exactly. When you're doing research quantitatively, there's two super important things: reliability and validity. Reliability means, do the results apply to the majority of similar cases? This is extremely hard to look at if you're only studying one person, much less yourself. Validity is, this is important. Validity is, are you measuring what you intended to measure? Are you actually answering your research question? I want to be clear that I don't think that either of these are valueless. Like, they both are important, but important to human value is not the same thing as evidence-based research. Like, it's not the same at all. So to people who are doing self-inquiry based on the definition of validity, like, your emotions and your experiences are literally invalid. You're not answering your research question. What you're saying is, this is how I feel about my past circumstances. That's not research. Just because you can cite a bunch of sources doesn't make your analysis true. I can write an article about how suicidal ideation affected my career choice, and I can cite 100 people on it. But at the end of the day, I'm just writing a jargony journal entry and found smart people who will affirm how difficult my life has been. And just just in case you were wondering about why we've actually canceled research, let's look at an article by Baines, 2021. I'm going to read this lovely little sentence. Decolonizing theory, which comes from critical theory, has brought forward the perspective that the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. How are you ever going to know anything if you dismantle research? Like, anyway. So, point of story, how does this lead to Charlie Kirk's assassination? So tragic. Because this trajectory has shown that we believe experience to be synonymous with knowledge and truth, and that this actually creates our identity and our humanity. So we can't identify with those who have differing beliefs anymore. Experience is truth, thoughts are being, consciousness is humanity. And when someone has differing opinions from you, the person now becomes the threat instead of their idea, because their being, and therefore their dignity as a human, is actually now reduced to the sum of their beliefs. Anecdotal evidence of this is if you look at people's response to Charlie Kirk's assassination, they all start by saying, well, even though I didn't agree with everything he said, or I firmly support everything he said, or whatever, they immediately give their thought-based opinion. Why? Because implicitly, we tie our value as people to our beliefs and our thoughts. If you can't think like me, you're not human. I live my experiences. I find my knowledge. I create reality. I determine truth. I determine if you are human. I determine that you are not worthy of life. It's like, rabbit hole, but that's the same reason we have abortion and people are harming their bodies, and according to gender perception, and why maid deaths are so high is because we actually don't see ourselves as whole people. We see ourselves as consciousness and thoughts. Or as Descartes would say, I think, therefore I am. It's not even just implicit. There's a scientist, Wesley Smith, who directly said that persons don't have to be human, and not all humans are persons. This is like light years beyond George Orwell's predictive narrative that all lives are created equal, but some are more equal than others. This is just like, all lives are created equal if they're actually lives, otherwise don't bother. So I created this little model to look at the difference in the ways of thinking between secularism and faith, because I think it's really important, and it's completely, it's not even compatible, unfortunately. I call it processing the God concept. So if you look at psychology, we'll talk about perception and cognition. There's top-down processing and bottom-up processing. And bottom-up is when, you start basically with no preconceived ideas or no absolutes, and you take information from your senses and it works up to your brain, and then you decide. And then top down is the other way around. So you have a preconceived idea, and then this informs your experiences. Obviously this is an adaptation of that, but anyway, let's look at secularism first, and then we'll go to the Christian worldview. So through secularism, we start with our experiences, which define what we know. What we know constructs our truth and our beliefs, and our beliefs inform our identity, and our identity defines what we consider to be humanity. But what happens when we define humanity is actually that we're putting ourselves in the position of God. So we decide who gets to live or not. Then let's flip this upside down from a Christian perspective. We start with God. We know that we are created in the image of God, and this gives us our humanity. And knowing this enables us to embrace our identity. And if you are a Christian and you believe in Jesus as your Savior and your friend, then you are a child of God. And so your identity is as his child, which defines the truth about who you are and what you believe. It defines our knowledge, the way we see the world, and gives meaning to our experience. Everything is filtered through the character of Jesus and who God is. Within this model, though, it's impossible for someone with a bottom-up approach to actually grasp how a Christian can really value humanity despite a difference in belief. And the reason is, when you look bottom-up, your belief and your experience is the predecessor and the building block to what it means to be human. But if you're looking at this through a Christian lens and you start with God, before we get to any of that, we know that humans are created with dignity, value, meaning, and purpose. It doesn't matter what your experience is, you are still important. You are still valuable. The reality is now this means that, like, to a secularist perspective, a Christian must be seen as a threat because our worldview directly opposes a secularist self-concept. And you have to have somebody, essentially, to give a cause to your effect. You have to have a purpose behind your experience. And so it's like, well, let's look at the Christians because they seem to have a reason. I don't know. But like, this is in the academic reading. So again, this is on the screen. There are processes that systematically discriminate against people who do not meet the ideal Eurocentric standard of white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian, and able-bodied. Essentially, this is like academically approved, institutionalized name-calling. The Christians are lumped together with a string of words that culture now considers to be insults. So we're assuming it's a white religion. We're assuming it's the same as European morality. We're assuming that Christianity is not oppressed, which is insane if you've ever been outside of Western society and they're like in jail and going to prison and getting their head chopped off. But that doesn't mean we're claiming victimhood as Christians at all. Why? Because victimhood is a temporary circumstance and it's not an identity. And anything different, if you accept yourself to be a perpetual victim, you also have to stand in perpetual accusation. So what can we do? We let everything be informed and characterized by a top-down approach, that we start with a God who visits us in human form and who is both mercy and truth. This turning point has to be one of repentance. We turn from advocating for an incomplete and false redemption that social justice has to offer, which breeds an endless pursuit of affirmation from everyone around us by saying that I'm only human and this is acceptable despite what I have done or what has been done to me. And instead, we have to dwell in restorative justice. Restorative justice is brought to life in the good news of Jesus. And we tell the truth. You say, you know what? My humanness, the fact that I'm only human, that I'm broken, that I'm a sinner, is not acceptable. It's not. But the reason that's good news is precisely because that the grace and kindness of Jesus forgives what I have done and heals what has been done to me. Isaiah says the wolf and the lamb will live together without fear. That means there is no victim. There is no oppressor. In the kingdom of God, the oppressor finds forgiveness and the victim finds healing, and they dwell in the family of God together. We have to believe that our humanity is not defined by our experiences, but in being created in God's image, in having redemption. And man, if you believe that Jesus died for you and rose from the dead and gives you new life, then your identity is as a child of God, and all of your experiences, everything you know, everything you believe, the truth of how the world happens around you flows out of that. It's a completely different narrative. We're no longer trying to decide what is right and wrong, the knowledge of good and evil, based on what we perceive. Instead, it's what he perceives. The God who created us. I'll end with a quote by Nick Freitas that just says, "Do you believe in God, or do you believe that you are God?"